Hello everyone, welcome to the Story Tales, your place for the best horror stories. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I've been listening to horror stories for years, and now I'm here to share the most amazing ones with you. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Moving into a new house is supposed to be exciting, right? A fresh start, a new adventure, and all that stuff people say to make you feel better about being overwhelmed. For me, though, the day I moved into 15 Maplewood Drive wasn't exciting. It was exhausting. By the time I was done lugging all those boxes inside, I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. The house itself was old, with peeling gray paint on the shutters and a sagging porch that groaned when I walked across it. The real estate agent had called it rustic. I called it barely standing. But it was cheap, and cheap was all I could afford. Inside, the place smelled like dust and something faintly sour, like wet wood left out too long. It was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you need to whisper, even when you're alone. The living room was a maze of cardboard boxes. I was determined to unpack at least a few things before collapsing into bed. I didn't even think about the basement at first. Sure, I saw the narrow staircase leading down when I walked through during the tour, but who cares about the basement when you're surrounded by enough boxes to build a fort? The first night, after stacking the last box in the corner, I sank onto the creaky old couch I'd brought with me and stared at the ceiling. Every muscle in my body ached, and I felt like I could fall asleep sitting up. I was about to do just that when I remembered I hadn't checked if the kitchen light worked. Dragging myself off the couch, I wandered toward the kitchen, flipping switches as I went. Most of the lights were dim, casting long shadows that made the rooms feel bigger than they were. When I reached the kitchen, I found a bulb so weak it barely counted as light. I made a mental note to buy brighter ones. That's when I heard it, a faint creak, like wood shifting under pressure. My head snapped toward the sound, but it was gone as quickly as it came. Probably just the house settling, I told myself. Old places like this always made weird noises. The thought of an entire basement beneath me didn't even cross my mind until I was brushing my teeth later that night. I spat toothpaste into the sink, glanced in the mirror, and caught my reflection looking more tired than I felt. "You're being dramatic," I muttered to myself, flipping off the bathroom light. I headed to bed, my mind swirling with all the things I needed to do. Unpack, find the nearest grocery store, maybe even introduce myself to the neighbors, assuming there were any. But as I lay there in the dark, I couldn't shake the nagging thought that I wasn't entirely alone. The next morning, I woke up to the sun streaming through the blinds. My back ached from sleeping on a mattress without a frame, and my mouth tasted like I'd been chewing on cotton all night. I groaned, stretched, and rolled out of bed. It wasn't until I was making coffee that I remembered the basement. The narrow staircase leading down was right off the kitchen, hidden behind an old wooden door with a knob that barely turned. I hadn't even thought to check what was down there when I first moved in. Now, as I sipped my coffee and stared at the door, curiosity started to creep in. What was down there? The agent had mentioned something about the previous owner storing tools, but she hadn't said much else. Setting my mug down, I walked over to the door and gave the knob a twist. It stuck at first, the wood swollen from humidity, but eventually, it gave way with a groan. The stairs were steep and dark, the kind of dark that makes you feel like you're stepping into a black hole. I reached for the light switch just inside the door, but when I flipped it, the bulb at the bottom flickered weakly before going out completely. Great. I grabbed my phone from the counter and turned on the flashlight. As the beam of light cut through the darkness, I felt a chill creep up my spine. The air down there was cold and damp, carrying the faint smell of mold. The basement was bigger than I expected, with concrete walls and a low ceiling. A few cardboard boxes sat in one corner, along with an old metal shelf that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the basement, there was a small door set into the wall. It was barely 3 feet tall, with a rusty padlock hanging from a thick latch. The wood was splintered in places, and the edges of the door were stained dark, like it had been wet once but dried out over time. I felt my stomach twist. Why would someone lock up a door inside their own basement? It wasn't like it led to the outside. This was deep in the center of the house. Curiosity tugged at me, but I didn't have the tools to open it even if I wanted to. I decided to leave it alone for now and headed back upstairs. For the rest of the day, I tried to focus on unpacking. I stacked books on shelves, hung a few pictures, and even managed to set up the TV. But no matter what I did, my mind kept drifting back to that door. By the time night rolled around, I couldn't take it anymore. Armed with a flashlight and a small hammer, I made my way back down to the basement. The air felt colder this time, almost like it had dropped a few degrees since the morning. I shivered and tightened my grip on the hammer as I approached the door. The padlock was solid, covered in so much rust that I doubted it had been opened in years. I tapped it with the hammer, and the sound echoed through the basement, sharp and hollow. Taking a deep breath, I wedged the claw side of the hammer under the lock and pushed. It didn't budge at first, but after a few tries, the rust gave way with a loud snap. The sound made me jump, and I froze, my heart pounding. Nothing happened. I pulled the padlock off and let it drop to the floor with a dull clang. Then slowly, I pulled the door open. The room inside was smaller than I expected, barely big enough for me to stand in. The walls were bare concrete, and the only light came from a dangling bulb in the center of the ceiling. What caught my attention, though, were the marks. They were everywhere. Scribbles, scratches, and strange shapes covered the walls from floor to ceiling, drawn in a dark, rusty red. At first, I thought it was paint, but as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't smooth enough for paint. The lines were rough and uneven, like someone had carved them into the wall with a sharp object. Some of them formed jagged spirals, while others looked like letters, though I couldn't make out any words. My chest felt tight as I ran my fingers over one of the marks. It was dry and chalky, and when I looked at my fingertips, they were smudged with red. I backed out of the room, my heart racing. Something about that place felt wrong. I slammed the door shut and ran upstairs, locking the basement door behind me. My mind raced with questions. Who had made those marks? Why were they there? That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the room. I tried to convince myself it was just an old storage space, but the images of those strange scribbles wouldn't leave my mind. I didn't know it then, but that little door was just the beginning of something I couldn't escape. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the strange marks on the walls. My mind kept conjuring up impossible explanations, rituals, secret messages, warnings, but nothing made sense. I tossed and turned until the first light of dawn seeped through the blinds. By then, I felt more exhausted than when I'd gone to bed. But staying under the covers wouldn't solve anything. I needed answers, or at least some sort of reassurance that I wasn't overreacting. Over coffee, I debated what to do. Calling the real estate agent crossed my mind, but what would I even say? Hey, can you tell me why there's a creepy room in the basement of the house you sold me? That would go over well. Instead, I decided to take a closer look at the room in daylight. Maybe I'd missed something in my rush to get out of there last night. Armed with my phone, a notepad, and an uneasy determination, I headed back down to the basement. The cold hit me again as soon as I opened the door, more intense this time, like the temperature had dropped even further overnight. My breath came out in faint puffs, and I rubbed my arms to ward off the chill as I descended the stairs. The small door at the far end of the basement stood just as I'd left it, slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The strange marks were still there, of course, but in the harsh morning light streaming through the narrow basement windows, they seemed less sinister and more puzzling. I stepped inside, careful not to touch the walls, and scanned the room with my flashlight. The floor was bare concrete, except for a few faint stains that I didn't want to think too much about. In one corner, there was a small pile of what looked like old scraps of paper, crumpled and yellowed with age. Curiosity got the better of me. I crouched down and carefully picked up one of the papers. The edges were brittle, threatening to crumble in my hands, but the writing on it was still legible. It wasn't English, or at least, not any English I recognized. The letters were jagged and angular, almost like runes, with strange symbols interspersed between them. "What the hell is this?" I muttered under my breath, turning the paper over. The back was blank, but there was something sticky on the surface, like it had been glued to something at some point. I set the paper aside and reached for another scrap, then another. Each one was filled with similar writing, the same angular characters repeating over and over. It didn't look like a language meant for communication, more like a code. As I gathered the papers into a small pile, something caught my eye on the far wall. It was a faint discoloration, almost invisible against the concrete, but it stood out just enough to make me curious. I walked over and ran my fingers across the surface. The texture was different, rougher, like something had been scraped away. A patch of paint or plaster, maybe. Then I saw it. Carved into the wall, just above eye level, were 4 small letters, R-H-S-C. They were faint, but deliberate, etched deeply enough to suggest that whoever made them wanted them to last. I traced the letters with my fingertips, trying to make sense of them. Were they initials? A name? A code? The sound of a faint creak behind me made me freeze. I spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. Just me, the strange symbols, and the cold. "This is ridiculous," I said aloud, though my voice sounded hollow in the small space. "It's just an old basement. Nothing weird is going on." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I tried to distract myself by unpacking, organizing, and even heading into town to grab some groceries, but the strange room lingered in the back of my mind like a bad dream. At the store, I overheard 2 women chatting near the produce section. They were talking about local history, something about the oldest houses in the area. "Excuse me," I said, interrupting them. "Do you know anything about 15 Maplewood Drive?" One of the women, a silver-haired lady with glasses, frowned thoughtfully. "Maplewood? Isn't that the old Harris place?" Her friend nodded. "Yeah, that's right. Poor family. What happened to them was such a shame." I felt my stomach tighten. "What happened?" The woman adjusted her glasses, her expression softening. "Oh, this was years ago. Decades, really. The Harris family lived there. Nice folks from what I remember. But then their youngest daughter went missing. Little Rachel, I think her name was. She was only 8. The second woman chimed in. "The whole town searched for her, but she was never found. Some people said she ran away, but, well, others thought something worse might have happened." I swallowed hard. "Did they ever figure out what happened to her?" The silver-haired woman shook her head. "No. And after she disappeared, the family couldn't bear to stay in the house. They moved away not long after." A chill ran down my spine. Could the initials I found in the basement, RH, belong to Rachel Harris? I thanked the women and hurried through the rest of my shopping, my mind racing with questions. Back at home, I spread the scraps of paper across the kitchen table, trying to make sense of the strange writing. I even pulled out my laptop and did a quick search for anything resembling the symbols, but nothing came up. The initials in the basement kept nagging at me. If they really did belong to Rachel Harris, what did that mean? Had she left them there? Was the basement somehow connected to her disappearance? The rational part of me wanted to dismiss the whole thing as a coincidence, but another part, a deeper, instinctual part, was screaming at me that there was more to the story. As night fell, the house seemed to grow colder, the air heavier. Every creak and groan of the old wood sent my nerves into overdrive. I tried to focus on anything else, reading, scrolling through my phone, even watching an old sitcom, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the basement. Eventually, I gave in. Grabbing my flashlight, I made my way back down the narrow staircase. The room felt different this time, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. The air was still cold, but there was something else, a faint pressure, like the weight of the room itself was pressing down on me. I stepped inside and turned my flashlight toward the walls, scanning the strange symbols once again. They looked the same as before, but as I stared at them, I noticed something I hadn't seen earlier. In the corner of the room, just beneath one of the carvings, there was a faint outline in the concrete floor. It was rectangular, about the size of a shoebox, and slightly darker than the surrounding area. Kneeling down, I ran my hand over the outline. The edges were rough, and when I pressed on one corner, the surface gave a little, like it wasn't entirely solid. My heart raced as I dug my fingers into the edges and pulled. The slab lifted with surprising ease, revealing a shallow compartment beneath it. Inside was a small wooden box, its surface worn and splintered. I hesitated for a moment before lifting it out and setting it on the floor. The lid was loose, and when I opened it, I found a collection of items that made my blood run cold. A faded photograph of a young girl, her wide eyes staring directly at the camera. A small, delicate bracelet with a charm shaped like a flower. And a folded piece of paper, covered in the same strange symbols that adorned the walls. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper, trying to make sense of the markings. But before I could study it further, a sudden sharp sound echoed through the basement. A loud, resounding thud from somewhere behind me. I whipped around, my flashlight darting across the room, but there was nothing there. The basement was empty, or at least it seemed that way. My pulse thundered in my ears as I clutched the box to my chest and bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. Something was wrong with this house. And whatever it was, I was in far deeper than I wanted to be. By the time I reached the top of the basement stairs, my hands were trembling so badly I nearly dropped the box. My heart pounded in my chest as I slid the lock into place, as if that flimsy barrier could shield me from whatever was lurking below. I set the box on the kitchen counter and stared at it, struggling to make sense of what I'd found. The photograph, the bracelet, the cryptic symbols, all of it pointed to something sinister, but I had no idea how to piece it together. The house was silent, save for the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. I grabbed my phone and searched for any trace of Rachel Harris online. It didn't take long to find an article from 1987. Local girl missing, community rallies for Rachel Harris. The grainy photo in the article matched the one I'd found in the box. According to the article, Rachel had vanished after playing outside one afternoon. No signs of foul play were found, and no leads ever surfaced. The case remained unsolved, a wound in the town's collective memory. The bracelet in the box suddenly felt heavier in my hands. Had it been hers? And if so, why was it hidden in the basement of this house? I knew I couldn't ignore the room, or its contents any longer. Whatever happened to Rachel, I was certain that basement held the key. Determined to figure out the truth, I grabbed a notepad and carefully copied the symbols from the folded paper. I cross-referenced them with everything I could find online. Runic alphabets, ancient languages, even obscure ciphers. Nothing matched perfectly, but one forum thread caught my attention. A user claimed the symbols were part of an old ritual language used in obscure occult practices. It wasn't widely documented, but they posted a partial translation key they'd pieced together. I compared the key to the symbols on the paper. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to decode the message. The door is sealed. The offering keeps it bound. My stomach churned as I read the words. What door? What offering? I returned to the basement. armed with a newfound resolve and a crowbar. The cold was worse than ever, biting at my skin as I descended the stairs. The room seemed darker somehow, the shadows deeper, but I ignored the unease and focused on the task at hand. The carvings on the walls took on new significance now that I knew they weren't random. They were part of something larger. A system, a spell, a warning. I scanned the room again, my flashlight sweeping across the walls and floor. Then I noticed something I hadn't before. One of the symbols on the far wall glowed faintly when the light hit it. I knelt down and inspected it more closely. The concrete there felt different, softer, almost hollow. I hesitated for only a moment before using the crowbar to chip away at the surface. The concrete crumbled easily, revealing a wooden panel beneath it. With a deep breath, I pried the panel loose. Behind it was a narrow passageway, just wide enough for me to squeeze through. The air in the passage was stale and thick, and I could barely see beyond the beam of my flashlight. The walls were lined with more carvings, some of which were faded and cracked. After about 20 feet, the passage opened into a larger chamber. My flashlight flickered as I stepped inside, the light catching on something in the center of the room. It was a stone pedestal, worn and cracked with age. Resting on top of it was a small, locked chest. Surrounding the pedestal were more of the strange symbols, carved into the floor in concentric circles. I approached cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The chest looked ancient, its metal hinges rusted and its surface covered in dust. A keyhole gleamed faintly in the dim light. I reached for the chest, but the moment my fingers brushed the surface, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. "Leave it," a voice whispered, so faint I almost thought I'd imagined it. I froze, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. But then, from the shadows, I saw movement. A figure, barely visible in the dim light. It was small, no taller than a child, and as it stepped closer, I realized with a jolt that it wasn't casting a shadow of its own. "Rachel?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure stopped, its head tilting slightly, as if acknowledging the name. "What happened to you?" I asked, my voice shaking. The figure pointed to the chest, its translucent hand trembling. You're in there?" I guessed, my mind struggling to keep up. It shook its head, then gestured to the carvings on the floor. "The offering keeps it bound." Suddenly it clicked. The symbols, the chest, the strange cold. It was all connected. Whatever was in that chest wasn't meant to be opened. The symbols were keeping it sealed, and the offering. Rachel had been the offering. The thought made me sick. Her life had been sacrificed to contain whatever was inside. "Why me?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why did I end up here?" The figure didn't answer, but the air around me grew heavier, almost suffocating. The symbols on the floor began to glow faintly, their light pulsing in rhythm with my racing heart. I backed away, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but something compelled me to stay. If I left now, I'd never get the answers I needed. I knelt by the chest, studying the keyhole. I knew opening it was a terrible idea, but the pull was almost irresistible. "Rachel," I said softly, "if I open this, can I help you?" The figure hesitated, then nodded. With trembling hands, I pulled out the bracelet from my pocket. The moment I placed it on the chest, the air in the room shifted. The symbols on the floor flared brighter, and the chest's hinges groaned as the lid creaked open. Inside was a single object, a blackened, charred fragment of something unrecognizable. It pulsed faintly, as if alive. The room shuddered, and a deep, guttural growl echoed from the shadows. The figure of Rachel began to fade, her form dissolving into wisps of light. "Wait," I cried. "What do I do now?" Her voice was faint, barely a whisper. "Destroy it." Before I could ask how, the growling intensified, and the shadows around me seemed to come alive. Tendrils of darkness reached toward me, cold and unrelenting. I grabbed the crowbar and swung it at the fragment, shattering it into pieces. The instant it broke, the room exploded with light, blinding and searing. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the basement floor. The passageway was gone, replaced by solid concrete. The strange symbols had disappeared, and the air felt normal. I sat up slowly, my head spinning. The box was gone, along with the photograph and the bracelet. Had it all been real? The next day, I packed up and left the house. I didn't care about selling it or breaking the lease. I just needed to get away. As I drove out of town, I passed the grocery store where I'd spoken to the two women. One of them stood outside, chatting with a younger man. She waved at me, and for a moment I considered stopping to tell her what I'd found. But what would I even say? That I'd freed a ghost and destroyed some ancient evil? Instead, I nodded and kept driving, the house shrinking in my rearview mirror until it disappeared completely. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew one thing for certain. I'd stumbled into something far bigger than myself. And whatever it was over now. Or so I hoped. My name is Jake, and I never believed in ghosts or spirits. That kind of stuff belonged in movies and old campfire tales, not in my life. But everything changed when I moved into an old, rundown house in Oakville. It was a quaint little town with a slower pace of life, exactly what I thought I needed after my recent move from the city. The house itself wasn't much to look at. 2 stories, peeling paint on the shutters, and a sagging front porch. But the rent was cheap, and it came fully furnished, probably because no one wanted to live there. Still, I convinced myself that the house had character. The first few days went smoothly. I spent my time unpacking, arranging furniture, and settling into the small town life. The house was quiet, though the silence felt heavier than I'd expected. The kind of silence where you can hear every creak, every shift in the wood, and even the faint hum of electricity running through old wires. I figured it was just the house settling, and I tried not to let it bother me. But things started getting strange on my 4th night there. It was a Thursday, and I had just drifted off to sleep when I heard a faint knocking sound coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. It was so soft at first that I thought I imagined it. Tap, tap, tap. I opened my eyes, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand. It was 2:17 a.m. I lay there, straining to listen. The sound came again, louder this time, as if someone, or something, was gently tapping on the wooden walls of the hallway. Probably the wind, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. I turned over, pulled the blanket tighter around me, and eventually fell back asleep. The next morning I tried to forget about it. I chalked it up to the quirks of living in an old house. After all, I'd signed up for this, hadn't I? Still, I couldn't ignore the faint uneasiness lingering in the back of my mind. After a quick breakfast, I decided to take a shower to wake myself up. The bathroom was small and outdated, with a yellowed tub and a rust-stained sink. A large mirror hung above the sink, its surface slightly warped with age. I turned on the shower, letting the water heat up while I brushed my teeth. The water's warmth was comforting as I stepped in, washing away the remnants of sleep. Steam quickly filled the bathroom, fogging up the mirror. I stayed under the water longer than usual, savoring the hot spray on my shoulders. When I finally stepped out and grabbed a towel, I glanced at the fogged-up mirror. That's when I saw it, a faint line etched into the condensation. It was subtle, almost like someone had run their finger across the glass. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or maybe a streak I'd missed when cleaning. Curious, I leaned closer. The line didn't form a clear shape or word. It was more like a random scratch. Must have been me, I muttered. though I couldn't recall touching the mirror. I wiped it clean with my hand and the line disappeared. Shaking my head, I went about my morning routine, pushing the incident to the back of my mind. The rest of the day was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was off. Every time I walked down the hallway, I felt like I was being watched. I laughed it off, telling myself I was just adjusting to the new environment. That night, the knocking returned. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was more deliberate, like someone was rapping their knuckles against the wall outside my door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the stillness of the house. No response. I sat up, my pulse quickening. The tapping continued, slow and rhythmic, as if teasing me. Summoning my courage, I got out of bed and opened the door. The hallway was dark, illuminated only by the faint moonlight streaming through the small window at the end of the corridor. "Is someone there?" I asked, stepping out cautiously. The tapping stopped. I flipped on the hallway light, but nothing seemed out of place. The old wallpaper, with its faded floral pattern, looked as dull and unremarkable as ever. The wooden floorboards groaned softly under my weight as I walked to the end of the hallway. I checked every door, every corner, but there was no one there. Feeling foolish, I returned to my room and locked the door behind me. I told myself it was probably just the house settling again. Still, I couldn't shake the prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if unseen eyes were watching me. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy and on edge. I decided to take another shower, hoping it would help me feel refreshed. As the water warmed and the bathroom filled with steam, I glanced at the mirror again. This time, the line was back, but it wasn't alone. 3 lines now crisscrossed the surface, faint but distinct, as if someone had deliberately drawn them. My stomach churned as I stared at the marks. They looked almost like scratches, uneven and jagged. "Okay, this is getting weird," I said aloud, my voice echoing slightly in the small bathroom. I wiped the mirror again, but when the condensation returned, the lines were still there. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of it. Could the previous tenant have scratched the mirror? Or was this some kind of prank? Feeling a mix of frustration and unease, I finished getting ready and left for work. The whole day, the image of those lines haunted me. I couldn't focus on my tasks, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, lurking behind me. When I got home that evening, the house felt different. The air seemed heavier, almost suffocating. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the unease gnawed at me. To shake off the tension, I decided to watch some TV and distract myself. I heated up leftovers, settled onto the couch, and flipped through channels until I found a sitcom. But no matter how much I tried to laugh at the jokes, I couldn't relax. The house felt too quiet, too still. Eventually, I decided to take another shower, hoping it would help me unwind. As I stepped into the bathroom, a sense of dread washed over me. I tried to ignore it, turning on the water and letting it cascade over me. When I stepped out and looked at the mirror, my breath caught in my throat. The lines had multiplied, forming a strange pattern. It wasn't random anymore. It was deliberate. My chest tightened as I realized I couldn't explain this away. Something was wrong with this house. I wiped the mirror, desperate to erase the marks, but they remained. My hand trembled as I backed away, the steam clinging to my skin. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every faint sound made me jump. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what I had gotten myself into. The house that once seemed charming now felt like a trap, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. And this was just the beginning. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. It took me a moment to remember where I was, back in the old house, where the walls creaked and the air felt unnervingly thick. I reached for my phone, squinting at the screen. It was a text from Sarah, a coworker I'd recently gotten to know. She'd been trying to pull me out of my shell since I started at the local insurance office a few weeks ago. Sarah. Morning, Jake. Don't forget lunch at the diner today. I replied with a quick, sure, see you then. But my heart wasn't in it. My thoughts kept drifting back to the mirror and the strange lines that refused to disappear. The pattern had etched itself into my mind, and the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that it was deliberate. Shaking off the lingering unease, I got ready for work. The house was eerily quiet, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched as I moved from room to room. Before leaving, I paused in front of the bathroom door, debating whether to check the mirror again. Curiosity won out and I stepped inside. The lines were still there, faint, but undeniable. They seemed to twist and turn in ways that made no logical sense, like some kind of arcane symbol. I took a photo with my phone, hoping to research it later. By the time I arrived at the office, I was running on autopilot. My coworkers greeted me with friendly smiles, but I barely registered them. At lunch, Sarah noticed my distraction almost immediately. "You okay, Jake?" she asked as we sat in a corner booth at the diner. She tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear and studied me with concern. "Yeah, just didn't sleep well," I said, forcing a smile. "Still getting used to the house?" I nodded, stirring my coffee absently. "Something like that." Sarah leaned forward, lowering her voice. "You know, there are some stories about that place." My stomach tightened. "What kind of stories?" She hesitated, glancing around as if making sure no one was listening. "People say it's haunted." I couldn't help but laugh, though it came out more strained than I intended. "Come on, Sarah. Haunted? That's just small-town gossip." She shrugged, but her expression remained serious. "Maybe, but it's been empty for years, and the last tenant left without a word. Didn't even bother to take their stuff." "That explains the furniture," I muttered. "Look," she said, leaning back. "I'm not saying you should believe everything you hear, but if something feels off, maybe you should trust your gut." Her words stayed with me as I returned to work and later, when I went home. By the time I walked through the front door, the sky was a deep shade of purple, and the wind had picked up, rattling the old windows. I made myself a quick dinner, but the house felt heavier than ever. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of the floorboards. That night, I tried to distract myself with a movie, but the knocking returned just as I was starting to relax. Tap, tap, tap. It was louder this time, echoing through the house with a deliberate rhythm. My body tensed, every nerve on high alert. I grabbed my phone and stood up, my eyes darting toward the hallway. The tapping continued, slow and steady, as if daring me to investigate. Summoning every ounce of courage, I walked to the hallway and flipped on the light. Nothing. But the sound didn't stop. It was coming from the basement. My heart pounded as I approached the basement door, which was slightly ajar. I hesitated, gripping the handle tightly. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I took a deep breath and opened the door. The stairs leading down were steep and narrow, disappearing into darkness. The light switch was just inside the doorway, but when I flipped it, nothing happened. "Great," I muttered, pulling out my phone to use its flashlight. The basement was cold and musty, filled with old boxes and furniture covered in dusty sheets. I scanned the room, my light trembling as I moved it from corner to corner. The tapping had stopped. I stepped down cautiously, each creak of the stairs sending a shiver down my spine. As I reached the bottom, I noticed something strange on the far wall, a set of faint markings, similar to the ones on the mirror. They were drawn directly onto the concrete, their lines jagged and uneven. My stomach churned as I approached, the air growing colder with each step. The markings formed a pattern that seemed both chaotic and purposeful, like a puzzle I couldn't begin to solve. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it was almost drowned out by the sound of my own breathing. "Leave," I froze, my phone shaking in my hand. The whisper came again, clearer this time, as if someone was speaking directly into my ear. "Get out." Panic surged through me, and I bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. My chest heaved as I leaned against the door, struggling to catch my breath. This wasn't just my imagination. Something was wrong with this house. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the whispers, felt the oppressive weight of the house pressing down on me. The next morning, I decided to do some research. I pulled up the photo of the mirror markings on my phone and searched for similar symbols online. Most of the results were useless. Esoteric forums filled with conspiracy theories and cryptic explanations. But one image caught my attention. It was almost identical to the markings in my mirror, labeled as an ancient protection sigil. The accompanying text described it as a symbol used to ward off evil spirits. My stomach dropped. If these were protection symbols, then what were they protecting against? I needed answers, and I knew exactly where to go. Later that day, I visited the Oakville Historical Society, a small brick building on the edge of town. The elderly woman at the front desk greeted me with a warm smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm looking for information on a house," I said, giving her the address. "Anything you have would be helpful." Her smile faltered slightly, and she adjusted her glasses. "That's an old property," she said, tapping the address into her computer. "It's been there since the late 1800s. She disappeared into the back room and returned a few minutes later with a thin folder. "This is what we have on file," she said, handing it to me. I sat down at a nearby table and opened the folder. Most of the documents were old property records and photographs, but one newspaper clipping caught my eye. The headline read, "Family vanishes without a trace." My blood ran cold as I read the article. It was dated nearly 50 years ago and described how a family of 4 had disappeared from the house under mysterious circumstances. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises in the weeks leading up to their disappearance, but no one had seen or heard from them since. I closed the folder, my hands shaking. Whatever was happening in that house, it had been going on for a long time. I returned home that evening with a sense of dread, but I knew I couldn't ignore the situation any longer. As I stepped through the front door, the house felt different, as if it was waiting for me. That night, I set up my phone to record the hallway outside my bedroom. If there was something, or someone, in the house, I was going to find out. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to sleep. Hours passed, and the house remained eerily quiet. But just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart hammering as the sound of tapping echoed through the house. The deliberate rhythm was louder than before, almost demanding attention. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I snatched it up to check the recording. The timestamp showed it had been capturing video for hours, but when I opened the file, my blood ran cold. The video started off uneventful, showing the dimly lit hallway outside my room. Minutes turned to hours with nothing but stillness, until, at 2:37 a.m., a shadow appeared. It wasn't the kind cast by furniture or the occasional passing car. It was distinctly human, dark and featureless, moving in and out of frame as if pacing the hallway. Then, at 2:39 a.m., the camera shook violently, and the video cut out. A chill crept up my spine. I didn't remember hearing anything that loud. Whatever was in the house was toying with me, and it was escalating. The tapping grew louder, snapping me out of my thoughts. I grabbed my flashlight and crept toward the hallway. The air was freezing, each breath visible in the pale beam of light. The sound seemed to come from every direction, echoing through the walls like the house itself was alive. "Who's there?" I called, my voice cracking. No response, only more tapping. I followed the sound to the living room, where the old mirror hung on the wall. My pulse quickened as I approached it. The markings had changed. They were no longer faint and indistinct, but carved deep into the glass, glowing faintly with an eerie white light. I reached out to touch the mirror, but the moment my fingers brushed the surface, a piercing scream erupted, shattering the silence. I stumbled back, clutching my ears as the mirror's surface rippled like water. The scream subsided into whispers, dozens of voices overlapping, their words indistinguishable but filled with anguish. The whispers grew louder, their urgency pulling me closer despite my fear. I couldn't look away from the mirror. My reflection twisted and warped, the lines on the glass forming patterns around my face like a web. And then, in a flash, I wasn't looking at my reflection anymore. I was looking at them. 4 figures stood in the mirror's depths, their features distorted and shadowy. They were the family from the newspaper clipping. I just knew it. Their hollow eyes bore into mine, pleading, accusing. "Help us," one of them whispered, her voice faint but clear. I stumbled back, shaking my head. "What do you want from me?" I yelled, my voice trembling. The woman's lips moved, forming a single word. "Basement." The light in the room flickered, and the tapping resumed, faster and more frantic. My heart raced as I turned toward the basement door, which now stood wide open. A cold wind blew from the dark staircase, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. I didn't want to go down there, but I didn't have a choice. This wasn't just about me anymore. If there was even a chance I could free those people, or whatever was left of them, I had to try. Gripping the flashlight tightly, I descended the creaking stairs. The tapping stopped as soon as I reached the bottom, replaced by an oppressive silence. The air was thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. The markings on the concrete wall were glowing faintly, just like the ones on the mirror. I approached them cautiously, my flashlight revealing more of the basement's grim secrets, old rusted tools, broken furniture, and something that looked suspiciously like dried blood on the floor. As I reached the wall, a sudden force slammed the basement door shut, plunging me into darkness. My flashlight flickered, and I felt a presence behind me, a cold, suffocating weight pressing down on my shoulders. "Leave," a voice hissed, so close it felt like it was inside my head. I spun around, but there was no one there. The air grew colder, and the glowing markings began to pulse, their light illuminating the basement in flashes. Each pulse revealed fleeting images: a man with hollow eyes, a woman clutching a child, and a shadowy figure standing in the corner, watching. The markings on the wall seemed to shift and rearrange themselves, forming a new pattern, a door. I didn't know how I knew it was a door, but the realization hit me like a thunderclap. This was what the family wanted me to find. I reached out to touch the glowing lines, and the wall began to tremble. The concrete cracked and crumbled, revealing a narrow passageway that descended even deeper into the earth. A foul stench wafted up, making me gag. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "Free us," they begged, "before it's too late." I stepped into the passageway, my flashlight barely piercing the darkness. The walls were damp and covered in strange symbols, their shapes writhing as if alive. The air grew colder with every step, and the whispers seemed to come from all around me. Finally, I reached a cavernous room. In the center was an ancient stone altar, surrounded by the same glowing symbols. Chains hung from the walls, their metal rusted and stained. On the altar lay a book, its cover blackened and charred. The whispers reached a crescendo as I approached the altar. The book seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, its pages fluttering as if caught in a non-existent breeze. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. Not now. I opened the book, and the symbols on its pages began to glow. The words were written in a language I didn't understand, but the meaning seeped into my mind like water through cracks. It was a ritual, a way to banish the darkness that had taken hold of the house. The whispers turned into screams as I read aloud, the words burning my throat like fire. The symbols on the walls flared brightly, and the ground trembled beneath my feet. Shadows swirled around me, their forms twisting and writhing in agony. "Stop!" a voice roared, deep and guttural. The shadowy figure from the basement appeared, its form towering and menacing. "You cannot undo this!" I ignored it, forcing the words out despite the searing pain. The figure lunged toward me, its claws reaching for my throat, but a burst of light erupted from the book, driving it back. The screams grew louder, deafening, as the ritual reached its climax. With a final desperate shout, I completed the incantation. The light exploded outward, engulfing the room in a blinding brilliance. The shadowy figure let out a bone-chilling scream as it dissolved into nothingness. When the light faded, the room was silent. The oppressive weight that had filled the house was gone, replaced by an almost serene stillness. The markings on the walls had vanished, and the book lay in ashes on the altar. I staggered back up the passageway, my legs shaking. The basement door was open, and the air felt lighter, cleaner. As I stepped into the living room, the mirror caught my eye. The family was gone. The glass was smooth and unmarked, reflecting nothing but my own exhausted face. I collapsed onto the couch, relief washing over me. The nightmare was over. The next day, I packed up my belongings and left the house for good. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Not Sarah, not the Historical Society, not even the new owners who moved in months later. Some things are better left unsaid. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror one last time. The house stood there, silent and unassuming, as if nothing had ever happened. But as I turned the corner, I thought I saw a faint shadow in one of the windows, a reminder that some things, no matter how hard you try, can never truly be erased. Hi, my name's Thatcher Reed, and I'm about to tell you a story that's been in my heart since the fall of 2003. It's a story I wish I didn't have to tell, but one that needs to be heard. I was 13 years old when it happened, and it's something that stayed with me every single day. If you're brave enough to listen, I'll begin. I grew up in Ironwood Hollow, Michigan, a small town surrounded by thick forests and deep lakes. It was the kind of place where people knew each other's names, and kids spent their weekends riding bikes or fishing by the docks. My life was pretty normal. I lived with my parents in a small, cozy house at the end of Maple Street. Dad worked at the town's lumber mill, and Mom ran a bakery that made the best apple pies in town. I was an only child, but I had 3 best friends who felt like family. There was Gideon Taylor, who lived across the street. He was tall for his age, with curly brown hair and a laugh that could make anyone smile. Gideon was the adventurous one, always coming up with new ways to get us into trouble. Then there was Brooks Lane. Brooks was quiet, always with a book in his hand and a thoughtful look on his face. He was the brains of the group, the one who made sure we didn't do anything too reckless. And finally, there was Alden Murphy. Alden was the oldest of us, just by a few months, but he acted like a big brother. He was strong and brave, but he also had a gentle side, especially when it came to animals. That fall, our school gave us a week off to enjoy the changing seasons. We called it the autumn break, and it was something we looked forward to all year. The air was crisp, the leaves were every color from gold to deep red, and the forest seemed alive in a way it never did during the summer. Gideon, always the ringleader, had an idea. "We should camp out," he said one afternoon, sitting on the steps of my porch. "Not in some boring campground. I mean real camping, deep in the woods. Just us." Alden raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that? There are bears out there." "Nah," Gideon waved him off. "Bears don't come this close to town. Besides, we'll have a fire. Bears hate fire." Brooks looked up from his book. "What about the Whispering Forest?" We all froze. The Whispering Forest was what people called the woods at the edge of Ironwood Hollow. No one really knew why it was called that, but there were stories. Stories about people hearing strange sounds at night, about shadows moving between the trees, about things that shouldn't be there. Gideon's eyes lit up. Exactly. That's where we should go. If we're going to camp, let's do it somewhere cool. I wanted to say no. Every instinct in my body told me it was a bad idea, but I didn't want to be the only one who chickened out. So I nodded. All right, let's do it. We packed our bags the next day. Alden brought a tent and some snacks. Brooks, always the planner, brought flashlights and a first aid kit. Gideon had a pocket knife and a map of the area, though he admitted it was old and probably useless. I brought my dad's camping stove and enough marshmallows to last a week. We set out after school, following a narrow dirt path that led into the forest. The trees grew thicker the deeper we went, their branches arching overhead like a tunnel. The light faded quickly, turning the world around us into a shadowy maze. By the time we reached a small clearing, the sun was almost gone. We set up the tent in a hurry, gathered wood for a fire, and settled in for the night. The fire crackled, casting warm, dancing light on our faces. We roasted marshmallows and told ghost stories, each one trying to outdo the last. Brooks was in the middle of a story about a haunted lighthouse when we heard it. A low, humming sound, like someone whispering just beyond the circle of light. What was that? Alden asked, sitting up straight. Probably the wind, Gideon said, though he didn't sound convinced. The whispering continued, growing louder and more distinct. It was as if 100 voices were speaking at once, but none of them made sense. Brooks grabbed his flashlight and pointed it at the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Let's just go to bed, I suggested, my voice shaking. We're probably just imagining things. No one argued. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps, circling the tent. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, something scratched against the fabric of the tent. Thatcher, Alden whispered from the other side. You awake? Yeah, I whispered back. Do you hear that? Before I could answer, the tent zipper slid down and cold air rushed in. But there was no one there. The fire had gone out, leaving only smoldering embers. The woods were completely dark, except for 2 glowing eyes in the distance. They weren't animal eyes. They were too high off the ground, too bright. And they were watching us. Run, Gideon whispered. We didn't need to be told twice. We grabbed our stuff and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring where we were going as long as it was away from those eyes. The whispering followed us, growing louder, more frantic. We stumbled into another clearing, gasping for breath. In the middle of the clearing was a circle of stones, each one covered in strange carvings. The air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on us. What is this place? Brooks whispered. I don't know, Alden said, looking around nervously. But we need to keep moving. Before we could leave, the whispering stopped. The silence was worse. It was the kind of silence that made your ears ring, the kind that made you feel like something was about to happen. Then the ground shook. Out of the shadows stepped a creature. It was tall, easily 8 feet, with long arms that ended in sharp claws. Its fur was matted and dark, and its eyes glowed with a strange, cold light. None of us moved. We were too scared. The creature took a step forward, and Gideon did the bravest, or maybe the dumbest, thing I've ever seen. He picked up a stick and threw it at the creature. Go away, he shouted. The creature tilted its head, almost like it was curious. Then it let out a sound, a deep rumbling growl that made the trees shiver. Run, Alden yelled. We ran again, but this time we weren't lucky. The creature followed us, its footsteps loud and heavy. It was faster than us, and we knew it was only a matter of time before it caught up. Then we saw lights, real electric lights. A cabin, just ahead. We banged on the door until an older man opened it. His name was Mr. Holloway, and he didn't ask questions. He pulled us inside, locked the door, and turned off the lights. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked. We nodded. Mr. Holloway told us about the forest spirit, an ancient guardian that protected the land. It didn't like people wandering too far into its territory. The stones were a warning, a sign that we had crossed into a place we didn't belong. We stayed in that cabin until morning, too scared to sleep. When the sun finally rose, Mr. Holloway walked us back to the edge of the forest. We never saw the creature again, but I know it's still out there, watching, waiting. If you ever find yourself near the Whispering Forest, remember this story. And whatever you do, don't go past the stone circle. Some places aren't meant to be explored. My name is Elias, but everyone calls me Eli. I'm 12 years old, and this story happened last summer when I was helping my Uncle Stan. Uncle Stan works at the town library, an old building that smells like dusty books and wooden floors. It's a quiet place, the kind that creaks when you walk. Uncle Stan is a bit of a character. He's tall, with a bushy mustache that twitches when he talks. He loves books, especially ones about mysteries and strange creatures. Every summer I spend a few weeks with him, and this time, he asked if I wanted to help sort books at the library after hours. I thought it would be fun, like my own little adventure. That night, it was just me and Uncle Stan. The library was closed, and the place felt bigger and emptier than usual. It was already dark outside, and the only light came from the old lamps in the corners. They made long shadows on the walls, making everything look taller and more twisted. "All right, Eli," Uncle Stan said, handing me a stack of books. "Take these to the back room. Be careful with the door. It sticks sometimes." I nodded and headed to the back. The back room was small, filled with shelves that reached the ceiling. As I put the books away, the air felt colder, like someone had opened a window, but I knew they were all closed. I shook it off and kept working. Then the phone rang. I jumped. The sound echoed through the quiet library. Uncle Stan answered it in the front room, but his voice sounded different. Usually he's loud and cheerful, but this time he was quiet, almost whispering. When he hung up, he walked over to me, his face pale. "Who was that?" I asked. "Wrong number," he said quickly, but I could tell something was off. He kept glancing at the windows, pulling the blinds down even though no one could see inside. I tried to keep working, but my hands felt shaky. The silence was heavier now, like the library itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, the phone rang again. Uncle Stan didn't answer it this time. He just stared at it, letting it ring. "Maybe it's someone who needs help," I said, but he shook his head. "It's not," he whispered. I picked up the phone anyway. "Hello?" There was a pause, and then a voice, low and raspy, said, "I can see you." My heart stopped. I slammed the phone down and backed away. Uncle Stan grabbed my arm. "Stay calm, Eli," he said, but his voice was shaking. We checked the doors. They were locked. The windows were closed. No one could get in without us knowing. But the voice, it knew. I grabbed my own phone and called 911. My fingers felt like jelly, but I managed to dial. "Someone's watching us," I told the operator. "They keep calling." "Is the building secure?" she asked. "Yes," I said, looking at Uncle Stan, who nodded. "We locked everything." "Stay on the line," she said. "We're sending help." Minutes felt like hours. The phone rang again. The operator told me not to answer, but I couldn't help it. I needed to know. I picked it up, my voice barely a whisper. "Stop calling." "You shouldn't have done that," the voice said. "You shouldn't have called them." The line went dead. I dropped the phone and ran to the window. The parking lot outside was empty, except for Uncle Stan's car. No one was there, but I felt eyes on me, watching, waiting. Uncle Stan tried to keep me calm, but I could tell he was scared too. He kept checking the door, making sure it was locked. "They can't get in," he said, more to himself than to me. Finally, we saw flashing lights outside. The police were here. I ran to the door and unlocked it. 2 officers came in, their faces serious. I told them everything. They searched the library, checking every room, every closet, but found nothing. The calls were real, though. They saw them on the phone log, but couldn't trace them. No number, no name, just silence. The next day, Uncle Stan closed the library early. I didn't go back that summer. Sometimes I wonder who, or what, was watching us that night, and why. I still love books, but I'm always careful about libraries after dark. You never know who might be on the other end of the line. My name is Reed, and this happened a few years ago. I was looking for a place to clear my head. Life in the city had gotten too noisy, too busy. So when I found a cabin deep in the woods, away from everything, it felt like the perfect place to start over. The cabin was old but sturdy, surrounded by tall trees that whispered in the wind. There was a narrow dirt road leading to it, but no other houses nearby. The nearest town, Pine Hollow, was about 10 miles away. That's how I liked it, just me and the quiet. The cabin's previous owner had left some furniture behind, nothing fancy, just enough to get by. I spent my first week cleaning, fixing a few broken windows, and enjoying the peace. The woods around the cabin were full of life. Birds singing, squirrels darting between branches, and once in a while, I'd hear the distant howl of a coyote. It felt like I had finally found my sanctuary. It was my 4th day there when I met Amos. I was chopping firewood out front when I saw someone walking up the road. Amos was tall and lean, with a thick gray beard and a worn-out brown jacket. He looked like he had spent most of his life outdoors. "Howdy," he called, waving a hand. "Hello," I replied, setting down the axe. "You must be the new fella," Amos said, stopping a few feet away. His voice was deep and gravelly. "Name's Amos. I live a couple miles down the road." I introduced myself, and we shook hands. His grip was strong, the kind you get from years of hard work. "This place has got some history," Amos said, looking around the cabin. "Been empty a long time. Folks around here don't come this way much." I shrugged. I liked the quiet. Amos nodded but didn't smile. "If you need anything, I'm around. Just keep an eye out at night. These woods can be strange." I wasn't sure what he meant, but I thanked him anyway. As he walked back down the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that he had wanted to say more. Over the next few days, Amos's words lingered in my mind. I kept busy fixing up the cabin and exploring the woods. But at night, the quiet felt different. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, owls, seemed distant, like they were holding their breath. One night, I was sitting on the porch when I heard something. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like footsteps, soft but steady, moving through the trees. I stood up, peering into the darkness, but saw nothing. The next morning I found footprints in the dirt near the cabin. They were large, too large to be mine, and they circled the cabin. I told myself it was probably a hiker passing through. But then Amos showed up again. "You been seeing anything unusual?" he asked, leaning on the porch railing. "Not really," I lied. Amos's eyes narrowed. "Listen, Reed, there's something you need to know. These woods, they have their own rules. Don't ignore the signs." "What signs?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. Amos didn't answer directly. "Lock your doors. Keep your lights on at night. And if you hear it, whatever you do, don't open the door." With that, he left. I followed Amos's advice. That night I locked all the doors and windows and left a few lamps on. I tried to read, but I couldn't focus. The woods felt too quiet, too still. Around midnight, it started. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. My heart pounded as I listened. They stopped at the front door. Knock, knock. I held my breath. The knock came again, louder this time. "Reed!" a voice called. It sounded like Amos, but something was off. It was too calm, too cold. "Go away!" I shouted. The voice laughed, but it didn't sound human anymore. The knocking turned into pounding. The walls shook, and the lamps flickered. I grabbed the rusty padlock Amos had given me and bolted the front door. As soon as I did, the pounding stopped. The air grew still. I waited, listening. When dawn broke, I stepped outside. The footprints were gone, but I knew what I had heard. The next day, I packed my things and left the cabin. As I drove down the road, I saw Amos standing by the edge of the woods. He didn't wave. He just watched, his face unreadable. I never went back to that cabin, and I never saw Amos again. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those woods and wonder what would have happened if I had opened the door. I don't know what's out there, but I know one thing for sure. Some places are better left alone.